research with you today, and I wanted to thank my co-organizers, my fellow panelists, as well as all of you for these rich discussions over the last 2 days. Historica Canada's Heritage Minutes attempt to inform Canadians about specific people and events that are, quote, a part of our national heritage. These minutes, though meant as a method to engage and educate Canadians, often distort the stories, and the Heritage Minute on the Underground Railroad is no exception. In this particular clip, a newly arrived fugitive slave is distressed because her father's 3 hours past the time he was expected to arrive in Canada. She is comforted by a white woman who tells her not to worry, as we have all done this before. The clip ends when the father emerges from the hollowed-out base of a church pew. This Heritage Minute is problematic mainly because it attempts to condense the entire Underground Railroad movement into 1 minute, and when it is finished, one is left with the impression that all was well when the fugitives arrived in Canada and in freedom. Most significantly, the clip perpetuates the mythologized legend of the Underground Railroad in both American and Canadian contexts. These narratives romanticize both the fugitives' flight to freedom, such as the need to escape with the help of white abolitionists, and methods of escape, such as hiding in wagons and church pews. Additionally, the clip does not speak to the lived experiences in Canada. And so, Canadians therefore have a responsibility to discover and understand the experiences of Underground Railroad migrants once they settled. In doing so, we not only complicate the Canadian national narrative, but we also blur the boundary between lived experiences and the United States and Canada. These migrants encountered many of the same prejudice, discrimination, marginalization, inaccessibility, and racism that plague the United States. This paper aims to contribute to the growing historiography that challenges the Underground Railroad's dominance in the discourse of African Canadian history. Historian Afua Cooper argues, quote, the Underground Railroad has a way of being used as a stand-in for all 400 years of Black Canadian history, especially in moments of multicultural celebrations. It is often caricatured, romanticized, sanitized, and presented as a relic, an object frozen in time, end quote. The narrative has played a key role in shaping Canada's identity as a quote-unquote moral lighthouse, especially when compared to our southern neighbor. Canada's legacy is entrenched in images of the North Star, of daring escapes from slavery, and is a country that is portrayed as a safe haven that was free from the persecution and racial prejudice of slavery and notions of Black inferiority. This narrative has captured generations of Canadians and people around the world as it promotes the image of freedom, equality, and full participation in Canadian life, regardless of skin color. However, this mythologized Underground Railroad narrative obscures the racism that pervaded Canadian society and celebrates only that these migrants reached Canada in freedom. It does not consider the challenges they experienced upon their arrival. According to historian James Walker, the myth of the Underground Railroad and the North Star has, quote, thus prevented any sincere examination of the situation faced by Blacks and other racial minorities. It has allowed most Canadians to believe that Canada has no race problem. The narrative's dismissal of these experiences indicates that contemporary anti-Blackness is not new, but is rooted in centuries of racial discrimination, even as Canada continues to be promoted as a multicultural country. The genesis of racial discrimination and notions of Black inferiority is rooted in slavery, which was practiced under the French from colonial rule from 1628 to 1763, and then under the British between the conquest of New France in 1763 and emancipation throughout the Empire in 1834. Therefore, from the very beginning of their histories in Canada, Blacks were associated with slavery and thus embodied a subordinate status and role in society. Walker notes, quote, from slavery grew many of the stereotypical characteristics applied to Blacks, particularly notions of dependence, lack of initiative, and suitability only for slavers' unskilled employment. However, the legacy of Canada is often erased, displaced, or ignored, as the elite have chosen to uphold the Underground Railroad and the flight of American slaves to freedom as the pinnacle of African Canadian historical experiences. In 1793, John Graves Simcoe, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, proposed an abolition bill to the House of Assembly. Although Simcoe did not manage to secure abolition outright, he did succeed in passing an act that resulted in the gradual abolition of slavery in the colony. This act stipulated that Africans who are currently enslaved in Upper Canada would remain so, but also that enslaved children born after 1793 would be free on their 25th birthday, enslaved Africans would be brought into the colony. This third compromise is especially significant to the development of the Underground Railroad, as it meant that any enslaved Africans who came north with their masters or who fled slavery would be free. This gradual abolition act also coincided with the first fugitive slave law passed by the United States Congress. This 1793 law, and the similar law that would be passed in 1850, empowered slaveholders to reclaim their escaped slaves from anywhere in the northern or southern states, regardless if slavery was legalized in that state or not. These laws, in combination with the inequality and discrimination, threatened and restricted freedom in the northern states, and thus black migration to Upper Canada began. Numbers escalated throughout the first half of the 19th century and reached an apex after 1850, when the United States Congress passed its second fugitive slave law. By 1861, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 men, women, and children had made their way north to Canada. The majority of these migrants came up through the Underground Railroad, a system of networks that were used to safely assist fugitives on their flight to freedom. However, not every migrant who arrived in Canada was fleeing slavery, and thus to describe these migrants solely as fugitive slaves or refugees cast them into a monolithic group despite their diversities and numerous nuanced identities. This terminology also raises questions of agency and autonomy, and as Cooper argues, results in the, quote, usual narrative of Canada rescuing the poor American slaves. This image is not only harmful to the legacy of these migrants, but is increasingly perpetuated by mainstream society, not only in a Canadian context, but in a global context as well. Referring to these migrants as fugitives and refugees also negates the experiences of free men and women who settled in Canada. Their journey north, and even the journey of those fleeing slavery, was not always an act of desperation, but the result of a calculated, well-planned, and deliberate decision. In the early 1850s, Benjamin Drew, a white abolitionist from Boston, toured the black communities of southwestern Ontario, or Canada West as it was known at the time, interviewing and collecting personal testimonies from 116 black migrants, which he published in an 1856 edited collection entitled A North Side View of Slavery, The Refugee, or Narratives of the Fugitive Slaves in Canada Related by Themselves. However, the collected interviews do not merely convey the lived experiences of fugitive slaves or refugees, as Drew's title suggests. He also includes testimonies from men and women who purchased their freedom, were manumitted by their masters, or who were born free and were living in the northern states and later immigrated to Canada. The personal testimonies from both enslaved and free migrants reveal the contemporaneous conditions of 14 black communities, and thus speak to the racial discrimination, prejudice, and segregation that riddled 19th century Canadian society. However, these interviews also disclose the diverse personalities of these migrants and thus highlight the resilient and determined character of this mobile population, whose central contributions were essential to Canada's settlement and colonization, an aspect that is completely left out of the Underground Railroad narrative. Many Underground Railroad migrants made their home in borderland regions along the Detroit River or Lake Ontario. Others traveled further inland and established communities in Chatham, London, and Toronto. Many of Drew's participants spoke to the racial discrimination they encountered when they in the areas they settled. Quote, "It is much to be regretted that the colored population do not, to a greater extent, avail themselves to the advantages presented by the perfect equality of English laws," Drew states when describing Canada. Yet it is scarcely to be wondered at when we consider the prejudice against them prevails to a great extent. Historian Robin Winks argues that there were no uniform patterns of prejudice among white Canadians. Some treated the migrants with kindness and saw them as assets to their communities. Others were worried about the competition for jobs and resources. Winks and Cooper point to the Negrophobia prevalent in mid-19th century Canadian society. The fight against slavery was against the immorality of its practice alone, and white Canadians did not agitate for black equality. Therefore, their complacency perpetuated racism and freedom as much as it was in slavery. Winks refers to the casual segregation that developed in urban areas. Black settlement was restricted to poor areas of town, and in the 1830s, black migrants were increasingly forced to sit in separate areas of most churches. By the 1850s, segregated schooling was sanctioned by law. Many of the testimonies Drew collected highlighted exclusion from public schools and the protests of white Canadians when integrated schooling was proposed. Kristen McLaren argues that the development of segregated schools in Canada West has led scholars to contend that this was a response to the black migrants' request to be separate. However, McLaren asserts that African Canadians continually oppose segregation and that the exclusion of this history is more indicative of, quote, fears that our society's foundational cultural myths might collapse under threat. Still more migrants resided in the all-black settlements of Buxton, Dawn, and Queensbush. At these settlements, and throughout the areas where they settled, black migrants established homes, schools, and churches. They cleared and farmed the land, built roads, and created businesses to cater and fulfill the needs of their co-settlers. In these respects, the Underground Railroad migrants, both formerly enslaved and free, contributed to Canada's colonization. According to the dominant Canadian narrative, however, the nation of Canada was built and created by white men, specifically by European colonists and their families who immigrated to the New World and were pioneers in the clearing and cultivation of land and the construction of cities. This national narrative has displaced the contributions of African Canadians and the Underground Railroad migrants. John Little, whom Drew interviewed at the settlement in Queensbush, provides a specific example of these efforts. Little and his wife escaped from slavery in Tennessee and fled to Canada, arriving first in Windsor before moving north to Queensbush, where they purchased 150 acres. Little and his wife, who is referred to only as Mrs. John Little, spent the next few years clearing their land and establishing a small home and farm, and he is only one of numerous black migrants who did so upon their settlement. Whether it is the enslaved Africans in New France, the black loyalists in Nova Scotia, the Underground Railroad migrants in Canada West, or the settlers out west, Africans and African-descended peoples played an instrumental role in Canada's settlement and colonization. These contributions, however, are left out of not only the Underground Railroad narrative, but also the narrative of Canada's colonization and settlement, precisely because they challenge the white European settler ideology. Anti-blackness in Canada is rooted in slavery, but it is aggravated by the dominance of the romanticized narrative of the Underground Railroad in Canadian media, politics, and ultimately its identity. All this is not to say that the Underground Railroad should not be celebrated. It is important to look critically at this narrative and to look beyond the narrative that is repeatedly presented to us. We need to examine the negative sides of our national histories as well as the positives. The struggles these migrants faced did not end when they crossed the U.S.-Canadian border. The strength, determination, creativity, and resilience of these migrants in the face of great odds needs to be celebrated. To do this, critical studies of the Underground Railroad are necessary precisely because the stories, struggles, and ultimately triumphs of these migrants deserve recognition and respect. Erasure of the past has prevented the recognition of the importance of the migrants, the discrimination they experienced in the Promised Land, their contributions to Canada's colonization, and the need to integrate their experiences into Canadian history. Black history is an integral part of Canada's history, and in order to know the history of Canada, it is necessary to understand all of its diverse narratives. We cannot wholly appreciate the pioneer history or the history of Canada's colonization if we do not acknowledge that institutionalized slavery was practiced here, or if we do not recognize the contributions of black settlers. The myth of the North Star and Canada's reputation as the Promised Land creates a false history that misinterprets lived experiences of discrimination, prejudice, and segregation, and celebrates the actions of only a few notable fugitives or prominent white abolitionists. The study of Black history is also essential because it shows that the race problem is real, created, maintained, and perpetuated through white participation and complacency. Black history highlights the indignities and restrictions perpetuated by white Canadians. Complacency has maintained barriers to accessibility and equity, rooted in the era of slavery, exacerbated by the romanticized narrative of the Underground Railroad, and continues to plague Canadian society today. As the famous saying states, those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it. Thank you.